Alrighty. It. I think I'm on. Yeah, this is on. Good, good. It is time to get started. Um, I was looking at the songs. I thought we'd do something fun tonight. That's true. I like to do fun. No, we're not doing Christmas songs. Side. Too early for Christmas. No. Yeah, Christmas in September. So we're going to break with the traditional two songs again tonight. We're going to sing three songs consisting of the medley that we find beginning in 851, going through 853. And then after this, I will ask Dawn to do our opening prayer, if that's okay, Dawn. So again, this is the medley. We're just going to do the verses with dots by them, 851 through 853. Just the verses with the dots by them. We'll sing these all the way through, have our opening prayer, and then we'll begin our study. So 851. Some glad morning when this life is o'er, I'll fly away to a home on God's celestial shore. I'll fly away, fly away, fly away. I'll fly away, oh glory. I'll fly away in the morning. When I die, hallelujah, by and by. I'll fly away, fly away, fly away. Just a few more weary days and then I'll fly away, fly away, fly away to a land where joy shall never end. I'll fly away, fly away, fly away. I'll fly away, oh glory. I'll fly away in the morning. When I die, hallelujah, by and by. I'll fly away, fly away, fly away. 852, verses 1 and 2. When the trumpet of the Lord shall sound, and time shall be no more, and the morning breaks eternal, bright and fair. When the saved of earth shall gather over on the other shore, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When Can you hear me now? All right. Well, Don prayed that we might be able to take into our hearts and minds what we studied tonight. And in an effort to do that, I come bearing gifts that'll help you take into your hearts and minds what we're going to be studying tonight. Shane, Phil, for you. These fun little handouts, as I'm calling them. Sure. All right. Do we need any more on this? One more? Okay. All right. And one more. All right. All right. What I've just given you, we are going to be looking at Mark chapter 16. But what I've just given you is kind of a supplement to what we're going to be talking about, which is the last 12 verses of Mark chapter 16. So if you have your handout, which I know you do, on that first page, you can jump down to letter H, which is titled the last 12 verses. I'm not going to be referencing this a whole lot, but it is some supplement to what we are going to be dealing with today. This material comes from the Workshop in the Word notebook, and this particular section, as you see at the bottom of your page, does come from Brother Guy Orbison. It's part of the introduction to Mark in that particular notebook, is this issue of the last 12 verses of Mark chapter 16. So again, if you're not already at Mark 16, please turn your Bibles there. But here in chapter 16, the Gospel of Mark is coming to a close, and Mark closed his Gospel with the reminder of not only the death and burial of Jesus, but also the resurrection of Jesus. Now, as a result of these things, this chapter tells the story of how Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, who's called here the mother of James, as well as this other woman named Salome, arrived at the tomb of Jesus very early on the first day of the week to find that it was empty, and there was a young man sitting on the right of where Jesus' body had been laid. That's verse 5 of this chapter. Following that, these women receive instructions to go tell Jesus' disciples, especially Peter, of what they had witnessed, to which they respond in verse 8 by fleeing because trembling and astonishment had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now that's the territory we covered last week, those first 8 verses of Mark 16. So it's that context that brings us to one of the most debated portions of Mark chapter 16, and probably one of the most debated portions of his gospel as a whole, which is verses 9 through 20. Now, is there anyone here who does not have verses 9 through 20 in Mark 16? Okay, everyone has verses 9 through 20? In some, not that I came across, but in most you might have a footnote about verses 9 through 20. Now, in the New American Standard, and I want to ask if in your guys' translations, if you have a different one, is there brackets around verses 9 through 20? Yes? Okay. That means that in some manuscripts, their verses 9 through 20 are not in Mark's gospel. They're not in the earlier manuscripts of Mark's gospel. Now, that being said, I just want to remind us that Mark's gospel that we have in our Bibles, it is not the first copy of Mark's gospel. It is not the one that Mark wrote himself. It is a copy of the one Mark wrote himself. And that's true of our Bibles, is a lot of what we have in our English Bibles are copies of what was originally written. It wasn't the the person's first copy that we have? Well, we have our manuscripts, copies of what's written. Now, with that being true, since people have copied what was written, what has sometimes happened over time is things got inserted into the text. Not things that were necessarily bad, but just things that were not originally there with the original author.
That doesn't seem like to me to be a good thing, honestly.
In some cases, it's not, because but that's why we have these footnotes in our Bibles that say, give you information on any certain text. But what we're going to see as far as verses 9 through 20 are concerned is a lot of what we find in verses 9 through 20 of Mark 16 can be substantiated by information we find in the other three Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John. But actually, let me pause there. Any other questions or comments before we keep moving forward?
Do you think later translations just have seen the others, this in the other Gospels and decide, well, we'll throw it in here too? It almost seems like that's the case.
That is part of the case, because if you take verses 9 through 20 out and end Mark 16 and verse 8, it ends on this note, well, they were afraid. Now, we hashed that out last class as to what really happened, because you had to go to other Gospels to find information on what that was all about. But some people who read Mark's Gospel said, this can't end on the fact that they were afraid. That was part of the mindset about how verses 9 through 20 came in. So, any other questions or comments? Okay. Now again, a lot of this information is found in what I just gave you. But still, before we get into the text, something else we should understand before we deal with the text itself is that based on manuscript evidence, there are at least 5 different endings that have been incorporated into Mark's Gospel. The first is the short ending. The second is the intermediate ending, as it's called. The third ending is the expanded ending. Ending number 4 is the long ending. And finally, the 5th ending is the lost ending. Now, what those are can be found in the handout I just gave you, but I do want to briefly touch on what's called the lost ending. The one called the lost ending is the one that supposes, well, there must have been more beyond verse 8 originally that just has been lost to history. But that's just assumption that's made. But again, more information about these 5 endings are found in the handout I just gave you. But point of all these things is that the different manuscripts we have of Mark's Gospel have made it difficult to determine where Mark's Gospel actually ends, but the general consensus is that it does in fact end at verse 8 and leaves the rest to the imagination of the reader if verses 9 through 20 are not there.
Just a quick question. How come then the translators for the American Standard and all the others chose to include that? Those last verses, I wonder.
Probably because they are found in some manuscripts, and so they put it in there, but that's why you have these brackets around them to indicate this isn't found in some of the manuscripts in the earlier manuscripts of Mark's Gospel. Now again, all these questions and stuff that's coming up are why 9 through 20 is such an issue in a study of Mark's Gospel. Did you have something else, Don?
Well, I was just wondering if the Dead Sea Scrolls shed any light on this.
The Dead Sea Scrolls lend more to the Old Testament. I don't know if there's any Dead Sea Scrolls that have New Testament information. You're right. So I'm sure if Jeremiah was here, he'd be able to tell us a little bit more. And I hate that I don't have that information for you. Anything else before we get into the text itself? Okay. But again, even though there's questions about verses 9 through 20, they can be accepted as authoritative. And that's because what is included in verses 9 through 20 can be substantiated by information we find in the other Gospels and even in other books of the New Testament. And we're going to touch on some of that as we deal with these last 12 verses of Mark's Gospel. So what we're going to spend time with as we look at these last 12 verses of Mark's Gospel are 3 points about what the last 12 verses of this Gospel make that we have in our English Bibles. First point we'll look at in verses 9 through 13 is that the last 12 verses record Jesus' appearance to others after his resurrection. The second point we will look at in verses 14 through 18 is that the last 12 verses record Jesus' commissioning of his followers to preach the gospel. And finally, the third point we'll look at in verses 19 and 20 is that the last 12 verses record Jesus' ascension back to heaven. Now, after looking at these things, what we'll learn from this is that the last 12 verses of Mark's Gospel, they do deserve our study. So let's, if there's no other questions or comments before we get into the text, we'll read verses 9 through 20. So again, Mark 16, beginning in verse 9, the text says, "Now after he had risen early on the first day of the week, he first appeared to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went and reported to those who had been with him while they were mourning and weeping. When they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they refused to believe it. After that, he appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they were walking along on their way to the country. They went away and reported it to the others, but they did not believe them either. Afterward, he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were reclining at the table, and he reproached them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who had seen him after he had risen. And he said to them, 'Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. He who has believed and has been baptized shall be saved, but he who has disbelieved shall be condemned. These signs will accompany those who have believed. In my name they will cast out demons. They will speak with new tongues. They will pick up serpents, and if they drink any deadly poison, it will not hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover.' So then, when the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went out and preached everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the word by the signs that followed. And they promptly reported all these instructions to Peter and his companions. And after that, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation." Now, as we get into these verses, I'm counting on a lot of questions and discussion. We'll see. Maybe you guys just want to listen. Either way is fine with me. But we're going to deal with a lot of things here. So I will tell you right now, this might be a little bit longer study, but that's okay. But there are 3 points that seem to be recorded here in these last 12 verses. Now, something else you're going to hear me say, instead of me saying my usual Mark records here, I'm just going to be saying the text says, since we don't know for certain if Mark himself penned these last 12 verses. But verse 9 begins the first point. The last 12 verses record Jesus' appearance to others after his resurrection. Now, in verse 9, who did he first appear to? And what are we told about Mary Magdalene there? Cast 7 demons out of her. So, we have some information about Mary Magdalene. She was healed from demon possessions. Verse 9 is one of those verses that can be substantiated by in other Gospels. We do know from the other Gospels that that Mary Magdalene was among the first that Jesus appeared to. But as far as this information of casting out 7 demons, we find that in Luke 8, verse 2. That's where we read about it. Questions or comments on verse 9? Okay. Now we are going to move a little bit quickly through this, but please stop me if you need me to slow down. So verse 10, Mary Magdalene has seen Jesus. Who does she go to, and what are they doing? Do you have the 12 in your translation, Shanna? In verse 10? But do you have, it says the 11 in verse 10? Okay. We'll talk about the 11 later. But verse 10 just says, and reported to those who had been with him, those who had been following Jesus. This might include, but is not necessarily limited to the apostles, because we're going to talk about the apostles a little bit later. But what are they doing when she comes to them? They're mourning and weeping. Why? Jesus has been crucified. As far as they know, Jesus is still dead. They haven't received the news of the resurrection. Now, with all that being true, one thing we should understand from this verse is that what the text records here is something that is also recorded in John 20, verse 18. But in that verse, we're not told that they were mourning and weeping. That's something that's reported here, but not over in John chapter 20. But in John chapter 20, we read the same thing. Mary Magdalene had come to report that she had seen the resurrected Jesus. Anything else on verse 10? Verse 11. How did they respond? They did not believe her. Very simple statement. We also read about this in Luke. In Luke 24:11, after hearing that Jesus had been resurrected, the words of Mary Magdalene appeared to the rest of Jesus' followers. Or Luke 24 says that her words appeared as nonsense. Now again, we're not going to these passages, I'm just referencing them. But what's added in Luke 24 is that they told Mary Magdalene basically, no way. It's nonsense. We just saw him crucified 3 days ago. There's no way you could see him alive. That's what Luke 24, or the idea of Luke 24:11 is. But the point's the same. They refused to believe it. But even though this is the case, Luke 24:12 says that in response to the words of Mary Magdalene, Peter still ran to the tomb. And after seeing what Mary and the other women had seen, he went home marveling at what had happened. So out of everybody that Mary Magdalene had came to, it is Peter who had some willingness to believe what she had said. Questions or comments on verse 11? Okay. So what happens next in verse 12? How did he appear? In another form. What does that mean, in another form? Not as himself. Not necessarily that these two individuals would recognize. Now, where are these two individuals headed here in verse 12? To the country. This is another verse that can be substantiated by another gospel. And that's again Luke chapter 24. And we find a more extended story there in Luke 24. In this verse, the text is recording in very summarized fashion the story we read about in Luke 24, verses 13 through 35. There's these two individuals, they're walking along, talking about what's gone on, and they're on the way to this village called Emmaus. And Jesus appears to them as the text says, in different form. That's also reflected in Luke 24. In Luke 24:16, that verse says that the eyes of these two individuals were initially prevented from recognizing Jesus. They could not recognize him. He's there, but they could not recognize them. Now, one reason for this, or actually let me rephrase that. This is this different form that prevented them from recognizing Jesus. It's not till we reach verse 31 of Luke 24 that their eyes are finally opened. Jesus is breaking bread at a meal, and it's at that point that they finally recognize this is Jesus. But Luke 24:31 says that at that point, Jesus vanished. All of that whole story is condensed into one verse here in verse 12 of Mark chapter 16. Questions or comments on any of that? Okay. So verse 13, we go on. Jesus has appeared to these two individuals. They go away and report it. What's the response in verse 13? They did not believe them either. Same point as verse 11. Jesus' second appearance is again met with disbelief. But while this is true, when we read verses 36 through 49 of Luke 24, Jesus finally appears to those who doubted and begins to speak to them himself. And so the disbelief that is recorded in verse 13 of Mark 16 and in verse 11 of this chapter, it was very short-lived because Jesus gradually appears to these people, even to those who doubted that he was alive. A lot of information. Questions or comments on verse 13? All right. So putting verses 9 through 13 together, the point we should see about the last 12 verses of Mark's gospel is that the last 12 verses record Jesus' appearance to others after his resurrection. In these verses, the text has shown in very summarized fashion the appearances of Jesus to others after his resurrection. Now, what these verses also show is appearances that can be substantiated by what we read in other gospels about Jesus' appearance to others following his resurrection. That brings us to point number 2, in verses 14 through 18. The last 12 verses record Jesus' commissioning of his followers to preach the gospel. That point is introduced in verse 14 with a third appearance. In verse 14, who does he appear to? The 11 who? 11 disciples, or we might say the apostles. Now remember, Judas at this point is dead. So you only have 11 apostles. Number 12 has not been replaced yet. But what does Jesus do when he appears to them? He reprimands them, Dina said, and yes, for their unbelief and hardness of heart. What had they not believed? That he had been seen after he'd been risen. So what does it mean to reprimand, or as the New American Standard has, reproach? What are you doing when you're reprimanding someone? You're scolding them. So Jesus, as we like to say in our household, got on to them for not believing what others had seen. And more specifically, the word reproach carries with it the idea of shame. Jesus was shaming them for not believing in and having a hard heart. Now, what the text does not record is the nature of this reproach. And this is, again, where we have to look to other Gospels to find out more about what this looked like. One example of the reproach mentioned here can be seen in what Jesus says to his apostles in Luke 24, verse 38. In that verse, he asks them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your hearts?" And that's a question that is asked in response to the fact that the 11 apostles thought they were seeing a spirit, or as we might say, Jesus' ghost. But why is it, just by way of review of Mark's gospel, why is this disbelief such an issue? What had Jesus been saying before he died? Crickets. What has Jesus been teaching there in these last days before he was crucified? What was he telling them? He said, don't be alarmed. But what did he say about his death and what would happen after that? That he would rise. the resurrection and people seeing him alive should not have come as a surprise, especially to the apostles, because he'd been teaching, I'm going to suffer, this is going to happen, but on the third day I'm going to rise again. They ignored that part. As a shorthand, yes. They ignored it, but we've also seen that there was a lot of misunderstanding toward a lot of the teachings of Jesus during these 3 years of his ministry. But we don't have much about this reproaching. Coming back in here to verse 14. We don't have much about how Jesus reproached the 11 apostles. Because this third appearance that we read about here, it actually began with a wish of peace from Jesus. He said, "Peace be with you," when he first appeared. And that's Luke 24, verse 36. Anything else in verse 14? Okay. So Jesus has reproached them. What does he do in verse 15? Gives them instructions, and I thought I heard something over here. And do what? And preach the gospel to all creation. Now in this verse, the text is now recording words of Jesus that are similar to ones we find in Matthew 28, verse 19. Jesus is getting ready to go back to heaven, and in Matthew 28, verse 19, he says to them, "Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations." This statement, "Go and preach the gospel to all creation," is the same idea. But he says to all creation. What does all creation mean? Everybody. It is, more literally speaking, every creature, but it's the idea of everybody. Now, why is that so important in this particular case to say everybody? Who's everybody, in other words? Jews and Gentiles. So Jesus didn't say preach the gospel to Jews. He didn't say preach the gospel to Gentiles. He said all creation, Jews and Gentiles. Because part of Jesus' teachings has been, when you read the Gospels, is that Gentiles would eventually come to be some of the chosen people of God, not just the Jews. And all that is through the gospel. Questions or comments on verse 15? All right. So verse 16, what are we told in verse 16 after Jesus gives the command of verse 15? Simple statement. That also reflects something else we find in Matthew 28. Now, I didn't give you all of Matthew 28:19. The beginning of Matthew 28:19 says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations." But you read the rest of that verse, part of that making disciples involves baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. That's the second half of Matthew 28:19. But here in Mark 16:16, the wording is such that if a person believes in the gospel and goes on to be baptized, will have salvation. But what will a person have if they do not believe? They will be condemned. What does that mean? To be condemned. Not saved. Very simply put, it means not saved. So since that's true, what is said here not only reflects what we read in Matthew 28, verse 19, but also what we read in several other passages of Scripture that indicate both belief and baptism are necessary to receive salvation. But on the other side of the coin, about being disbelieving and being condemned, also reflects passages that indicate if a person does not believe, they will not have salvation. One of those passages is John 3, verse 18, where Jesus says, "He who does not believe has been judged already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God." So again, More of this that we find in these last 12 verses of Mark's gospel can be found in the other gospels. But we're not done there. Any questions or comments on verse 16? All right. Verse 17. So we're getting to a little more of the tricky portion of these things. I'll just read verse 17 again. The text says, "These signs will accompany those who have believed. In my name they will cast out demons. They will speak with new tongues." I'll pause there. So we run into this idea of signs that will accompany the salvation of those who have believed. Now, what are signs? Okay, there's something you see. But what else do we associate with signs in the Bible? Direction, that's the definition of the word. Miracles. That's what this list that goes into verse 18 is. It's a list of miracles. But yes, signs, that word signs does refer to something that points you in a direction. But we have the beginning of a list here. Now for the people who have believed and by extension been baptized, what will they be able to do according to verse 17? Cast out demons, speak in tongues. It's these miraculous powers. These two things, and then we'll talk about verse 18 in a minute, are also things that we read about in other New Testament passages. Casting out demons, we've read about that in Mark. Jesus has done it himself. We saw with Mary Magdalene, cast out 7 demons. And then speaking with new tongues, we see it in Acts chapter 2 first, but we also read about it in the book of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 deals with being able to miraculously speak languages that are not otherwise known by the speaker. That's what tongues are. They're human languages. Anything else on verse 17? Verse 18 continues the list. What else will they be able to do? Okay, pick up serpents. What else? Drink deadly poison, and it won't hurt them. And heal the sick. Lay hands on the sick. That's the idea of healing. So, these are 3 additional miraculous powers. But of these 3, you only read about 1 in the rest of the New Testament. Now, the most questioned of these is this idea of picking up serpents. Because the word for serpents here, it's the generic term for snake. Poisonous or non-poisonous. It's just the general snake species, for lack of a better term. Now, because that's true, some have believed that serpents is used here in a metaphorical sense, to say that the person who believes has the ability to overcome spiritual serpents. Now, why is this, before I go forward with that, why is the serpent such a significant creature in the Bible? He was cursed. Satan, Genesis 3. Ever since Genesis 3, the serpent has had this association with Satan because of what happened in the garden. That's why some have believed that this picking up serpents is a metaphorical idea to say that even if the spiritual serpent attacks, they'll be able to overcome because of their faith in Jesus. Now again, this is just what some have said. But then we have drinking deadly poison. This is another one we don't read about in the New Testament. And that's why it's also been taken in a figurative sense to say that people who believe will not suffer harm from spiritual poison. Again, this is just what people are saying. And all because you don't read about the picking up of serpents or drinking deadly poison in other places in the New Testament. Now, the exception to the serpents is where Paul in Acts 28 picks up a poisonous snake and doesn't get hurt. But the word used for snake in that verse is the word that's exclusively poisonous snakes. It's not the word used here. I know I'm giving a lot of information. But questions or comments on poison or serpents before we look at laying hands on the sick? Okay. So we come to laying hands on the sick. Again, of these three that we find here in verse 18, this is the only one we read about elsewhere in the New Testament. We have a lot of healing accounts in the Bible. Jesus himself healed. We find a lot in Acts chapter 3, Acts chapter 14. James chapter 5 talks about laying hands and healing the sick. So this is one that has not been spoken of in a figurative sense simply because we do read about it elsewhere in the Bible. A lot of information. Anything else on verse 18? Making sense? Not confusing anybody? Okay. All right. So putting verses 14 through 18 together, the point we should see about what the last 12 verses record is that the last 12 verses record Jesus' commissioning of his followers to preach the gospel. The text has shown that Jesus called his followers to preach the gospel to everyone everywhere. And what these verses have also shown is that what would happen with those who believed in the gospel and those who did not believe. But finally we reach verses 19 through 20. The last 12 verses record Jesus' ascension into heaven. Now, this point is introduced with the text recording some more words from about Jesus. And what does verse 19 tell us? Okay, and what happened at that point? Sat down at the right hand of God. Now at this point in the text is recording for us what we read about in Acts chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. That's where we read about the ascension itself. Now it's also believed that this verse has as its background Psalm 110, verse 1, which is a psalm of David, where David is picturing the Lord as saying to David's Lord, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." But we have this idea of sitting at the right hand. We've run into it before at different points. But what is this idea of sitting at the right hand, especially of God? What position are you in? Authority. So Jesus not only went up to heaven, he sat in a position of authority in heaven at God's right hand. Questions or comments on verse 19? All right. So verse 20, the last 12 verses, with this being recorded then in verse 20, the last verse recorded here in Mark's Gospel conclude with a note about how Jesus' followers carried out their mission, and we find an additional paragraph about how these instructions were delivered to Peter and his companions, at which point Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Now we said at the beginning, verses 9 through 20, they're in brackets, at least in most of our translations. Now in that second half of verse 20, is it bracketed in your guys' translation as well? Okay. No. Casey says no. Okay. Well, the first half of verse 20 and the second half of verse 20 are believed to be from two separate manuscripts. It's strange, I know, but that's why, at least in some of our translations, the second half of verse 20 is bracketed. But we have to deal with it. Verse 20 of verses 9 through 20 is the most problematic. And it becomes problematic is because the first part of verse 20, as I've said, and the second part of verse 20 seems to be a combination of manuscripts. But even though this is the case, what is written here in verse 20, as what is written in verses 9 through 19, can and does fit into the context of what we read about Jesus' followers doing after they received the instructions after the resurrection and his ascension back to heaven. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time breaking down the text, but The idea here in verse 20 is just summarizes everything. They went out, they followed Jesus' instructions, preached everywhere, they did miracles that confirmed the message, and then this last paragraph just deals with Peter receiving the instructions to do what Jesus had done and Jesus working through them as they carried out the word, called here the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. A lot of information, again. Questions or comments? All right. So putting all these things together, the point we should see from verses 19 and 20 about the last 12 verses of Mark 16 is that the last 12 verses record Jesus' ascension into heaven. Now the text has shown that the last thing Jesus' followers witnessed following Jesus' resurrection is his ascension back into heaven. Now what these verses have also shown is that after Jesus ascended back to heaven, his followers began to preach everywhere, with Jesus working with them through signs that confirmed the message of the gospel. And finally, these verses have also shown that Peter and his companions received the instructions to preach, after which Jesus himself sent out his followers to proclaim the gospel from east to west, which is, as we've already seen, the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. So, what point should we take from the last 12 verses of Mark's gospel? They're authoritative. They might have been thrown in later manuscripts, but they're still authoritative. Well, why? Because they can be substantiated by other gospels. But as far as the points here that they can break down into is that they record Jesus' appearance to others after his resurrection. They record Jesus' commissioning of his followers to preach the gospel. And finally, they're authoritative because they record Jesus' ascension back to heaven. So what do we learn in application? We have to pay attention to these last 12 verses of Mark's gospel. They deserve our study. These words may not have been written by Mark himself, but they still deserve our study. Why? Because they can and do fit into the context of the other Gospels. They deserve our study because they give us greater insight into the work of Jesus and his followers following his resurrection. Another reason these last 12 verses deserve our study is because they give us more insight into what we must be doing in our service to our resurrected Lord, knowing that we will one day see him again. My voice is tired. Any other questions or comments? All right. Again, my voice is tired, so Matt, I will ask you to close us in prayer.